The moment Garrett Thompson walked into Oakridge Middle School, every eye tracked the Iron Brotherhood patch on his back. His 12-year-old daughter was about to graduate top of her class. He promised his dying wife he'd be there. But before her name was even called, two men approached with one demand. Move to the back or leave. Garrett didn't move. He didn't argue. What he did instead brought 12 more brothers through those doors and turned a school ceremony into something no one in that Oregon gym would ever forget. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The gymnasium at Oakridge Middle School hummed with the restless energy of 300 families packed into folding chairs that creaked with every shift of weight. The air was thick with anticipation and the warm salty scent of pretzels drifting from the concession stand near the entrance. Parents adjusted their phones, angling for the perfect shot. Grandparents fanned themselves with ceremony programs. Younger siblings squirmed in their seats, bored before the event had even begun. In the third row, front section, sat a man who didn't squirm. Garrett Thompson occupied his chair with the kind of stillness that suggested he'd learned long ago that movement wasn't always necessary. His frame was substantial. 6 feet 3 inches in of road-worn muscle beneath a spotless black leather jacket. The Iron Brotherhood patch on his back was unmistakable. The Steel Eagle, a declaration that didn't apologize for itself. His hair, dark and streaked with gray, hung past his shoulders. His beard was heavy, carefully maintained, the kind that spoke of discipline rather than neglect. But it was his hands that told the real story. They rested on his knees, palms down, fingers relaxed. In his right hand, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a small keychain worn smooth by years of handling. It caught the fluorescent light of the gymnasium in brief flashes. The keychain had belonged to his wife. It was the only piece of her he carried everywhere. The noise around him continued. Families greeting each other. Teachers directing students toward the stage risers. The principal testing the microphone with sharp taps that echoed across the space. Garrett didn't turn his head. His eyes were fixed forward, trained on the rows of chairs being filled by 12-year-olds in their best clothes. Each one clutching a certificate they hadn't yet earned, but would receive in moments. Somewhere in that lineup was his daughter. That was the only reason he was here. Then the noise shifted. Not louder, but different, purposeful. Footsteps approached from his left, deliberate, and measured. Garrett didn't flinch. He'd heard footsteps like that before. Authority announcing itself before words ever left the mouth. The security officer stopped beside him, dark blue uniform, radio clipped to his shoulder, hands clasped in front of him in a posture meant to suggest calm, but communicating something else entirely. The man leaned in just slightly, not enough to be overtly aggressive, but enough to make it clear he expected compliance. "Sir," the officer said, his voice low, but firm. "We're going to need you to relocate." Garrett didn't respond. He didn't look up. His hands remained where they were, resting on his knees. The keychain pressed gently into his palm. His breathing didn't change. The muscles in his jaw didn't tighten. He simply existed in the space he'd chosen as if the request hadn't been made at all. The officer waited 5 seconds 10. The silence between them became its own kind of statement. Around them, families continued their conversations, oblivious or pretending to be, but a few heads turned. A mother 2 rows back nudged her husband. A teenager with a phone angled the camera slightly in their direction. The officer shifted his weight. "Sir, this is a family event. We'd appreciate your cooperation." Still nothing. Garrett's eyes remained forward. His posture didn't shift. There was no aggression in his stillness, no threat, but there was also no submission. It was the kind of presence that said without words that he'd chosen this seat for a reason, and that reason wasn't up for negotiation. The officer's hand moved toward the radio on his shoulder, fingers hovering near the call button. The gesture was small but deliberate. A warning, a reminder that authority had options. Garrett's thumb brushed across the surface of the keychain. Once, twice. The motion was so subtle it could have been mistaken for a nervous habit. But it wasn't nervousness. It was grounding. A reminder to himself of why he was sitting in this chair in this gymnasium surrounded by people who looked at his jacket before they looked at his face. He'd made a promise to a woman who wasn't here anymore. To a 12-year-old girl who was standing somewhere on that stage, probably scanning the crowd for him, hoping he'd kept his word. Garrett had kept a lot of promises in his life. Some to brothers who'd pulled him from burning wreckage on a desert highway. Some to a code older than he was. But this one, this promise to show up for his daughter, was the one that mattered most. And no amount of discomfort, no security officer with a radio and a rule book was going to move him from the seat he'd chosen. What he did next wasn't what they expected. And it's why his daughter still talks about this day. 3 years before that gymnasium, Garrett Thompson had been a different kind of still. The kind that comes when your body stops obeying commands. The kind that arrives with smoke and the smell of burning rubber and the distant dreamlike awareness that something has gone terribly wrong. Interstate 84 stretched across the Oregon desert like a scar. Endless asphalt shimmering under a July sun that turned the air into something you could taste. Garrett had been riding solo that day. His bike humming beneath him with the steady rhythm that always cleared his mind. No destination, no timeline, just the road and the heat and the freedom that came with both. He'd been riding for 20 years by then. He knew the machine beneath him better than most people knew their own heartbeat. But knowing doesn't stop physics. And it doesn't stop the blown tire at 70 miles an hour that sent his bike into a violent shimmy before it pitched him sideways into the guardrail. Metal on metal with a sound that erased everything else. The bike tumbled Garrett with it. The world spinning into a chaos of sky and asphalt and pain that arrived in waves too fast to separate. When the spinning stopped, he was pinned beneath 600 pounds of twisted steel. Fuel leaking onto scorching pavement. His leg bent at an angle that didn't exist in nature. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe right. His ribs had cracked on impact. Every attempt at air like swallowing glass. The sun pressed down on him without mercy, and the smell of gasoline grew stronger. Somewhere in the haze of shock, he understood what that meant. Fuel and heat and a single spark. He had minutes, maybe less. The desert was empty. No cars had passed in the last 20 minutes before the crash. Interstate 84 wasn't what it used to be. Most people took the newer routes now, left this stretch of history to decay in the sun. Garrett's phone had shattered in the crash, scattered in pieces across the shoulder. His vision blurred at the edges, darkening in a way that felt less like passing out and more like shutting down. That's when he heard the engines. Not 1. 12, the deep, unmistakable rumble of Harley-Davidsons approaching from the east, growing louder until the sound filled every corner of the desert silence. Garrett's vision was too blurred to see them clearly at first, but he felt the vibrations through the asphalt as they slowed, then stopped. Boots hit the ground in rapid succession. Voices barked orders sharp and efficient. No panic in them, just action. Hands gripped the bike frame. Multiple sets working in coordination. One voice deeper than the others cut through the haze. On 3, lift together. Don't drop it on him. They lifted. 600 pounds of burning metal rose off Garrett's chest and leg, and the air that rushed into his lungs was the sweetest thing he'd ever tasted. Someone dragged him clear of the wreckage, fast but careful, pulling him 20 feet away from the bike before lowering him onto his back. The hands that moved him were calloused and steady. The hands of men who'd done hard things before and would do them again. One of them knelt beside him, blocking out the sun. Garrett's vision cleared just enough to see the patches. Iron Brotherhood, full colors. The man's face was weathered, his eyes sharp with the kind of focus that came from experience. "Stay with me, brother. Ambulance is 10 minutes out. You're not dying on this highway." Garrett tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. His words stuck somewhere between intention and sound. The man placed a hand on his shoulder, firm but not rough. "Don't talk, just breathe. We've got you." And they did. While they waited for the ambulance, the 12 brothers formed a perimeter around him, keeping him shaded from the sun, keeping him conscious with steady conversation that didn't require him to respond. One of them poured water on a bandana and pressed it to Garrett's forehead. Another checked his pulse, calm and methodical. They didn't know him. He wasn't wearing colors. He wasn't part of their club, but they treated him like he was. When the ambulance finally arrived, sirens cutting through the desert heat, the brothers stepped back, but didn't leave. They waited until the paramedics loaded him into the rig until the doors closed and the ambulance pulled away. Only then did they mount their bikes and ride on, disappearing down Interstate 80 for the same way they'd come. Garrett had been alone on that highway, and then he wasn't. 12 strangers had stopped, had lifted burning metal off his body, had kept him alive when the desert wanted him dead. They hadn't asked for anything in return. They hadn't even asked his name. That was the day Garrett Thompson learned what brotherhood really meant. Not the word, not the idea, the action, the showing up when it costs something, the lifting of weight that isn't yours to carry, the refusal to leave a man broken on the side of the road. It was the day he understood what loyalty looked like when it wasn't convenient. And it was the day that would define every choice he made for the next 3 years. 6 months after the crash, Garrett sat beside a hospital bed in a hospice room that smelled like lavender and something else he couldn't name. Something clinical, something final. The afternoon light filtered through pale curtains, casting everything in a soft glow that felt wrong for what was happening. Sarah's hand rested in his, smaller than he remembered. The skin paper thin and cool to the touch. She'd been fighting for 2 years. Stage 4, the kind of cancer that didn't negotiate. The doctors had given her weeks. That was 3 weeks ago. Now they were talking about days, maybe hours. Her breathing was shallow, labored. Each inhale a small battle she was slowly losing, but her mind was still sharp. Her eyes, when they opened, still held the same fire that had drawn him to her 20 years earlier in a dive bar in Portland, where she'd been bartending, and he'd been trying to forget a bad week. She'd never asked him to change. Not once, not when they married, not when Riley was born, not when others whispered that being with a man in a motorcycle club was dangerous, was reckless, was no way to raise a daughter. Sarah had looked at those women with the same calm strength. She looked at everything and said, "He's a good father. That's what matters." Now, lying in that hospice bed with machines monitoring the slow shutdown of her body, Sarah squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of every year they'd spent together. "Garrett." He leaned closer, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in slow, careful strokes. "I'm here, baby." Her eyes found his, held them. "Riley, I know." "No." The word came out sharper than her condition should have allowed. She swallowed, gathered herself. Listen to me. Be there for her. Every milestone, every moment that matters. Don't let the road take you away from her. Garrett felt something crack inside his chest. Something that had been holding steady through 2 years of hospital visits and chemo appointments and middle of the phone calls from doctors with bad news. I will. I promise. Not just physically there, Sarah continued, her breathing more ragged now. Be present. She's going to need you. She's going to need to know that her father shows up, that he keeps his word, that he's steady when everything else falls apart. He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Sarah's hand moved weakly toward the chain around her neck, the one with the small keychain she always kept close. Garrett helped her remove it, his fingers clumsy with emotion. She pressed it into his palm, closing his hand around it. Every milestone, she repeated. Promise me. I promise. She smiled then, small and tired, but real. You're a good man, Garrett Thompson. Don't let anyone tell you different. 6 months later, Sarah was gone. The funeral was small. Family, a few close friends, and 12 Iron Brotherhood members who stood in the back row wearing their colors with quiet respect. They didn't know Sarah well, but they knew Garrett. And when a brother hurt, you showed up. That was the code. After the service, after the condolences and casseroles, and the slow emptying of his house as people returned to their lives, Garrett was left with an 11-year-old daughter and a promise that felt heavier than any weight he'd ever carried. Riley had always been a bright kid, but grief had a way of either breaking people or forging them into something harder. He watched her choose the latter. She threw herself into school with an intensity that worried him at first until he realized it was her way of coping, her way of making her mother proud. Straight A's became her baseline. She joined the debate team, stood in front of crowds, and argued cases with a confidence that reminded him so much of Sarah it hurt to watch. By the time she reached 6th grade, Riley Thompson was at the top of her class. A name teachers mentioned with genuine admiration. Every report card, every award, every small victory, Garrett was there. Front row when he could manage it. Back row when the stairs got too heavy, but always present, always keeping the promise. Riley became his North Star, the fixed point in a life that had always been defined by movement, by the road, by the next ride. She was the reason he turned down runs that would keep him away too long. The reason he showed up to parent-teacher conferences in his leather jacket and listened patiently while teachers tried to hide their discomfort. The reason he kept going when grief threatened to pull him under. Sarah's keychain never left his pocket. He carried it everywhere. A reminder of the woman who'd seen past the patches and the reputation to the man underneath. A reminder of the promise he'd made in a hospice room that smelled like lavender and endings. But Garrett's loyalty to his brothers would be tested in a way even they didn't expect because showing up wasn't always simple. Sometimes it meant standing your ground when the world wanted you gone. Sometimes it meant choosing between the code you lived by and the comfort of people who didn't understand it. And sometimes it meant sitting in a gymnasium full of families who looked at you like a threat, refusing to move because a promise made to a dying woman was worth more than their fear. The microphone squealed with feedback, sharp enough to cut through the gymnasium chatter and pull every head toward the stage. Principal Margaret Sullivan, a woman in her mid-50s with silver hair, pulled back in a tight bun, tapped the mic twice more before speaking. Her voice carried that practiced blend of authority and warmth that came from 20 years of standing in front of crowds. Good evening, families, friends, and most importantly, our outstanding 6th grade graduates. Polite applause rippled through the rows. Parents straightened in their seats, phones already raised to capture the moment. The students on the stage risers shifted nervously, some grinning, others looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. 12-year-olds in their Sunday best, caught between childhood and whatever came next. Riley Thompson stood in the second row of risers, fifth from the left. She wore a simple navy dress her grandmother had bought her. Her dark hair pulled back with clips that kept trying to slip loose. Her hands gripped the certificate holder they'd all been given, though the actual certificates wouldn't be distributed until names were called. She was scanning the crowd. Her eyes moving methodically across the rows of faces, searching. Principal Sullivan continued, "Today we celebrate not just academic achievement, but character, growth, and the promise of bright futures ahead. These young people have worked incredibly hard, and they deserve our recognition and support." More applause. Riley's eyes kept searching. Third row, front section, and then she found him. Her father, Garrett Thompson, sitting exactly where he'd said he'd be. The relief that crossed her face was immediate, followed quickly by something else. Pride. The kind that straightened her spine and lifted her chin just slightly. He'd kept his promise again. For a moment, their eyes met across the gymnasium. Garrett didn't smile. That wasn't his way. But his hand moved to his chest briefly, touching the spot where Sarah's keychain rested in his pocket. Riley understood. It was their silent language. He was here. He wasn't going anywhere. But the moment broke when she noticed the security officer standing beside her father speaking to him in low tones. Her stomach tightened. She'd seen this before at the school science fair at the winter concert. People who looked at the leather jacket before they looked at the man wearing it. She watched her father's stillness, the way his hands remained on his knees, the way he didn't react. She knew that stillness. It was his strength. Principal Sullivan was introducing the district superintendent now, her voice blending into background noise as Riley's attention stayed fixed on her father. Then she saw the second security officer approaching. This one was younger, broader in the shoulders, walking with the kind of confidence that suggested he wasn't used to being told no. The first officer stepped aside slightly as his colleague leaned in. Riley couldn't hear the words, but she could read body language. The way the second officer gestured toward the back of the gymnasium. The way his hand moved to his hip where the radio sat. The way parents in nearby rows turned their heads, no longer focused on Principal Sullivan's words, but on the man in the leather jacket, who wasn't moving. "This is a family event," the second officer said, his voice low, but firm enough that the people in the immediate vicinity could hear. "Your attire is causing discomfort for some of our families. We're going to need you to relocate to the back, or we can arrange for you to watch from the hallway." Garrett's eyes remained forward. His hands remained on his knees. His breathing didn't change. The keychain pressed into his palm, grounding him the way it had 1,000 times before. He didn't speak. Didn't acknowledge the request. Didn't give them the reaction they were waiting for. The silence between them stretched. 5 seconds, 10. The murmur in the gymnasium grew louder. Phones shifted from pointing at the stage to pointing at the third row. A mother 2 rows back whispered to her husband loud enough that the words carried. "Is that one of those gang members?" Another parent pulled their phone out, fingers moving across the screen. Texting, recording, sharing the moment with people who weren't even in the room. On stage, Riley's hands tightened around the certificate holder. Her classmate beside her, a girl named Sophie, who'd been her friend since 3rd grade, leaned in. "Riley, is that your dad?" Riley's jaw set. "Yes." "Why are they?" "Because they're judging him." Riley interrupted, her voice quiet but sharp. "They always do. The second security officer shifted his weight, clearly growing frustrated with Garrett's non-response. He glanced at his colleague, then back at Garrett. "Sir, I need a verbal acknowledgement that you understand what I'm asking." "Nothing." Garrett's chest rose and fell with steady breaths. His thumb brushed across Sarah's keychain. Once, twice, a reminder, a promise kept is worth more than their comfort, worth more than their fear, worth more than their judgment. The first officer reached for his radio, fingers hovering over the call button. The gesture was visible enough that more heads turned. The whispers grew louder. Parents exchanged glances. Some looked concerned, others looked annoyed, though whether at Garrett or the security officers wasn't clear. A few looked curious. Phones now openly recording the interaction. Principal Sullivan paused mid-sentence, her attention drawn to the commotion in the third row. Her expression flickered with something. Concern maybe, or calculation. Before she continued speaking, though her words came faster now, as if she could smooth over the tension with momentum. Riley watched it all unfold. Watched the way people looked at her father like he was a problem to be solved rather than a man keeping a promise to his daughter. She'd seen this her whole life. The stares, the whispers, the assumptions. But she'd also seen the other side. The way her father showed up when other kids' parents didn't. The way he listened when she talked about things that mattered to her. The way he'd held her when Sarah died and promised he'd never leave her alone. If you've ever been judged for how you looked instead of who you are. If you've ever been told you didn't belong because of what you wore or what people assumed about you, then you understand what was happening in that gymnasium. Because what happened next wasn't just about one father and one security guard. It was about every person who's ever been made to feel less than because they didn't fit someone else's idea of acceptable, and it's for every single one of you. The double doors at the back of the gymnasium swung open with a force that wasn't violent, but was impossible to ignore. The sound of metal hinges echoing across the space cut through Principal Sullivan's words mid-sentence, through the whispered conversations, through the ambient noise of 300 people packed into folding chairs. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. 12 men entered in single file. Iron Brotherhood full colors. The patches on their backs were identical to the one Garrett wore. Steel Eagle, unmistakable lettering, the silver and black that announced affiliation before names were ever exchanged. Their boots struck the hardwood floor in a rhythm that wasn't synchronized, but felt coordinated nonetheless. Each footfall deliberate and unhurried. Leather creaked with movement. The sound amplified in a gymnasium that had suddenly gone quiet enough to hear it. They didn't rush. They didn't posture. There was no swagger, no theatrical entrance designed to intimidate. They simply walked, their presence alone, doing all the communicating necessary. The lead man was in his early 60s, his gray beard braided, his eyes scanning the room with the calm assessment of someone who'd walked into tense situations before. Behind him, the others ranged in age from late 30s to mid-50s. Each one carrying themselves with the same quiet certainty. They moved past the rows of families who'd pressed themselves slightly into their seats, creating space that hadn't been asked for, but was given anyway. No one spoke. No one moved to stop them. The security officers near Garrett, the ones who'd been so focused on making him relocate, now stood frozen mid-step, their hands hovering near radios they weren't reaching for. Not yet. The 12 brothers didn't congregate in one spot. They spread out deliberately, taking seats in the rows surrounding Garrett. Some sat directly behind him, others flanked him to the left and right, filling in the empty spaces that parents had quietly vacated when the security confrontation began. They sat down without ceremony, without looking at Garrett, without acknowledging the security officers or the principal, or the 300 sets of eyes now fixed on them. They simply occupied space they decided belonged to them. Principal Sullivan's voice had stopped the moment the doors opened. She stood at the podium, one hand still resting on the microphone, her prepared remarks forgotten somewhere between the page and her mouth. Her eyes moved from the brothers to the security officers to Garrett, calculating. The silence stretched thick and heavy, broken only by the creak of leather as one of the brothers adjusted his position and the distant hum of the gymnasium's air conditioning system, struggling against the Oregon heat. On stage, Riley's expression shifted. The fear that had been building since the security officers first approached her father. The familiar dread that came from watching people judge him, from knowing this moment might be ruined the way other moments had been ruined, began to melt away. Her grip on the certificate holder loosened slightly. Her shoulders, which had been tense and pulled forward, straightened. Something fiercer took root in her chest. Something that felt like vindication and protection and pride all tangled together. She knew some of these men, not all of them, but enough. The one with the braided beard had been at their house for dinner once, had sat at their kitchen table, and told stories about the old days, while Sarah laughed, and Garrett smiled in that quiet way of his. Another one, younger with a scar across his cheek, had helped them move furniture when they'd changed apartments 3 years ago, had refused payment and said brothers didn't charge brothers. These weren't strangers. These were the men who'd pulled her father from a burning wreck on Interstate 84. These were the men who'd shown up at her mother's funeral and stood in the back row with their hands folded and their heads bowed. These were the men who just walked into her 6th grade graduation ceremony because someone had decided her father didn't belong. The first security officer finally found his voice, though it came out quieter than before. Less certain. Gentlemen, this is a closed school event. We're going to need to see identification and verify that you have students participating in today's ceremony. None of the brothers responded. They sat in their chairs the same way Garrett sat in his, still present, unmoved by the request. The officer looked to his colleague, who looked to the principal, who still stood at the podium with her hand on the microphone and her prepared remarks abandoned. A phone buzzed somewhere in the crowd. Then another. Parents were texting, calling, posting. The moment was being documented in real time, shared beyond the walls of the gymnasium to people who would form opinions without context, without understanding, without knowing that sometimes showing up is the most powerful statement you can make. One of the brothers, the one with the braided beard, who sat directly behind Garrett, leaned forward slightly. He didn't touch Garrett's shoulder, didn't speak, just leaned forward enough that Garrett could feel his presence, could know without turning around that he wasn't alone, that he'd never been alone. That the call Garrett had made earlier that morning. The single text message sent to one brother that said nothing more than Riley's graduation, Oak Ridge Middle, 6 p.m., might need backup, had been received and answered in the only way that mattered, by showing up. The second security officer reached for his radio again, his hand actually closing around it this time. The first officer took a step toward the nearest brother, then stopped, seeming to reconsider. Principal Sullivan's fingers tightened on the microphone. The superintendent, sitting in the front row, turned in his seat to look at her, his expression unreadable. 300 people held their breath. 12 brothers sat motionless in their seats. One father kept his hands on his knees and his eyes forward. And one 12-year-old girl on stage felt something shift inside her. The understanding that loyalty wasn't just a word people said, but an action people took when it cost them something. The principal had 2 choices. She could call the police, turn this ceremony into a spectacle, risk the kind of confrontation that would make the local news and haunt the school district for months. She could escalate, could treat these men like the threats some parents clearly believed they were. Could make this about control and authority and the enforcement of rules that said some people belonged and others didn't. Or she could do something no one expected. Principal Sullivan set the microphone back in its stand with deliberate care. The soft click amplified in a silence that had settled over the gymnasium like fog. She descended the stage steps, her heels striking each riser with measured precision. Her expression carefully neutral in the way administrators learn to mask what they're really thinking. Every eye in the room tracked her movement as she crossed the gymnasium floor toward where the 2 security officers stood near Garrett and the 12 brothers who'd formed a protective constellation around him. She moved with purpose but not panic. Her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her shoulders squared. When she reached the lead security officer, she leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper that the families in nearby rows strained to hear, but couldn't quite make out. The officer's expression shifted from rigid authority to something more uncertain as she spoke. His eyes moved from her face to Garrett to the brothers and back again. Principal Sullivan gestured toward Garrett first, a subtle movement of her hand that seemed to be making a point rather than issuing a command. Then her hand swept in a wider arc encompassing the 12 men who sat in various rows, their leather jackets and patches on full display, their presence impossible to ignore or dismiss. The second security officer leaned in to join the conversation, his hand still resting near his radio, his body language tense with the kind of readiness that suggested he wanted action, wanted resolution, wanted someone to make a decision so he could do his job. The whispered conversation continued. Principal Sullivan shook her head at something one of the officers said. Her hand came up, palm out, in a gesture that was part stop and part request for patience. The first officer's jaw tightened. He said something back, his voice still too low to carry, but his tone suggesting disagreement. Principal Sullivan responded, her words coming faster now, more insistent. She gestured toward the stage, toward the students who were still standing in their risers, waiting for a ceremony that had been derailed by a conflict that had nothing to do with their achievements. The second officer's hand moved toward his radio, fingers beginning to unhook it from his belt. Principal Sullivan's hand shot out, not grabbing him, but placing her palm firmly on his forearm. The gesture was clear. Stop. Wait, not yet. The officer hesitated, his eyes searching her face for explanation or justification. She leaned in closer, said something that made his hand drop away from the radio, and returned to his side. Meanwhile, on the stage, Riley Thompson stood gripping her certificate holder so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her friend Sophie stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, her eyes wide as she took in the scene, unfolding below them. Sophie had known Riley since 3rd grade, had been to her house for sleepovers and homework sessions, had met Garrett in passing, but had never asked the questions that sometimes hung in the air when kids notice something different about someone's family. Sophie leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. Riley, what's happening? Why are all those guys here? Riley's throat felt tight. She kept her eyes on her father, watching the way he sat perfectly still while adults debated what to do about him. While security officers treated him like a problem that needed solving, while 12 men who'd ridden across town sat in silent solidarity with a brother who'd needed them. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. That's my dad. Sophie's head snapped toward her, confusion flickering across her face. Wait, that's your dad. The one they're trying to make leave. They're not making him leave, Riley said. Something fierce creeping into her tone. He's not going anywhere. Sophie's eyes moved from Riley to Garrett and back again, trying to reconcile the quiet girl who aced every test and never caused trouble with the man in the leather jacket who just brought 12 more leather jackets into a middle school gymnasium. But why are they? I mean, who are all those other guys? His brothers, Riley said simply. Like actual brothers. The kind that matter. Sophie absorbed this, her face showing the kind of confusion that came from trying to fit new information into old assumptions. She'd grown up in a world where fathers wore polo shirts and khakis to school events, where they worked in offices and talked about golf and blended seamlessly into crowds of other fathers who looked exactly like them. The man in the third row didn't fit that template. Neither did the 12 men surrounding him. Are they dangerous? Sophie asked, the question coming out tentative, like she was afraid of the answer, but needed to ask anyway. Riley's eyes never left her father. She watched the way his hands rested on his knees, steady and calm. She thought about the nights he'd helped her with homework at the kitchen table, his patience endless when she didn't understand something. She thought about the way he'd held her when Sarah died, his arms solid and safe when the world felt like it was collapsing. She thought about every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every moment he'd shown up when other kids' parents hadn't. His presence a constant even when people stared. Only if you threaten someone they love, Riley said finally. The words hung between them. Sophie didn't respond, but her expression shifted slightly, something like understanding beginning to dawn. On the gymnasium floor, the whispered conversation between Principal Sullivan and the security officers continued. Parents shifted in their seats, phones still raised, capturing a moment that none of them fully understood, but all of them would have opinions about later. Riley had never told her friends about her father's club. It wasn't shame exactly, though there had been moments. Birthday parties where she'd asked him to drop her off a block away, school events where she'd hoped he might skip the jacket just once. Conversations where other kids talked about their dad's jobs and she changed the subject. It wasn't that she wanted to hide him. It was that she'd learned early that people judged the patches before they knew the man. And explaining the difference was exhausting. But watching him now, watching the way he refused to move or defend himself or give the security officers the confrontation they seemed to be preparing for, watching the way 12 men had walked through those doors because one of their brothers had needed them. She understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. Her father had never hidden his colors because hiding would have been a lie. The jacket, the patches, the club, they weren't costumes he put on. They were part of who he was, woven into his identity the same way his promises and his loyalty and his love for her were woven in. He'd never hidden because hiding would have taught her that some parts of yourself should be kept in shadows. That belonging meant making yourself smaller. That love required you to pretend to be something you weren't. She was about to find out why he never hid it. And why on this day in this gymnasium that refusal to hide would matter more than any of them had expected. To understand what was happening in that gymnasium, you have to understand the code that governed every man sitting in those rows. The Iron Brotherhood aren't just a motorcycle club. They're a brotherhood bound by principles that most people never see because they're too busy looking at the patches and making assumptions. Loyalty, respect, brotherhood. These aren't just words stitched on leather. They're commitments that get tested in ways most people will never experience. Loyalty means showing up when it cost you something. When the call comes at 2 o'clock in the morning because a brother's bike broke down 300 miles from nowhere. When a funeral needs attending and you've got work the next day, but you go anyway because that's what brothers do. When someone you've known for 20 years sits in a gymnasium being told he doesn't belong and you drop everything to ride across town because he shouldn't have to stand alone. Respect means understanding that every person you meet is carrying something you can't see. The single mother working 2 jobs who looks at your jacket with fear because her ex-boyfriend wore one and left bruises. The veteran who sees the patches and remembers brothers he lost overseas. The kid who thinks motorcycle clubs are all violence and crime because that's what television taught him. Respect means you don't have to agree with their fear or their assumptions, but you don't escalate either. You give them space to be wrong about you. Brotherhood means you're never alone, even when you're sitting by yourself in a room full of people who want you gone. It means 12 men here that one of their own might need backup, and they don't ask questions or demand explanations. They just get on their bikes and ride. It means the bond forged between people isn't about blood or last names. It's about shared experience, about who was there when the chips were down, about who lifted the weight when you couldn't carry it yourself. But there's another part of the code that most people don't understand because it's quieter, harder to see. Restraint. Real strength doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to threaten or posture or prove itself to people who've already made up their minds. Real strength is sitting perfectly still while security officers treat you like a threat. Real strength is hands resting on knees when every instinct says stand up and defend yourself. Real strength is 12 men walking into a room and saying nothing, doing nothing, just being present in a way that changes everything without changing anything at all. 3 years ago, on a stretch of Interstate 84, where the desert stretched endlessly in both directions and the heat turned asphalt into something that shimmered like water, Garrett Thompson had learned what this code looked like in action. He'd been pinned beneath 600 pounds of twisted metal, fuel leaking onto scorching pavement, his vision blurring at the edges with shock and pain. The smell of gasoline had grown stronger with each labored breath. He'd understood in the dim awareness that comes when your body is shutting down that he had minutes before the fuel found a spark and turned wreckage into an inferno. Then the engines had come. 12 Harleys approaching from the east, their rumble cutting through the desert silence. Boots hitting pavement, voices calling orders, hands gripping the bike frame, lifting in coordination. 600 pounds rising off his chest and legs. Someone dragging him clear of the wreckage. Fast but careful, pulling him 20 feet away before the fuel did what fuel does. One of them had knelt beside him, blocking out the sun, his weathered face sharp with focus. Stay with me, brother. You're not dying on this highway. They hadn't known him. He hadn't been wearing colors. He'd been a stranger on the side of the road, broken and burning. But they'd stopped anyway. They'd lifted the weight. They'd kept him conscious with steady conversation while they waited for the ambulance. And when one of them had said, as the paramedics loaded Garrett into the rig, "We don't leave brothers behind," it hadn't been about patches or clubs or membership. It had been about the fundamental understanding that some things mattered more than convenience, more than schedule, more than the assumption that someone else would handle it. That was the day Garrett understood what brotherhood really meant. And when he'd healed, when he'd gone looking for those men to thank them properly, they'd offered him something more valuable than rescue. They'd offered him belonging. A place where loyalty wasn't conditional and strength was measured by who you showed up for, not by how loud you could be about it. Now sitting in the gymnasium with Sarah's keychain pressed into his palm, Garrett was living that code in real time. His hand rested on his knee, thumb brushing the worn metal surface in slow, steady strokes, grounding himself, remembering the promise he'd made in a hospice room that smelled like lavender and endings. Be there for Riley every milestone. Don't let the road take you away from her. But his brothers were living the code, too. They sat in their scattered positions around him, silent and still, their presence alone shifting the dynamics of the room in ways that had nothing to do with intimidation and everything to do with solidarity. They hadn't asked Garrett why he needed them. They hadn't questioned whether a middle school graduation was worth the ride. They just came because that's what brothers do. Near the back of the gymnasium, a parent stood up. A man in his 40s wearing a button-down shirt and glasses, his face tight with discomfort. He gathered his wife and 2 younger children, murmuring something about getting air, about it being too crowded, about needing to step outside for a moment. They moved toward the exit, the father's hand on his son's shoulder, hurrying without quite running. Then another parent stood, a woman this time, clutching her purse, her eyes darting between the brothers and the door. She walked quickly down the aisle, her heels clicking against the hardwood. The security officer near the exit watched them go, his expression unreadable. He didn't try to stop them, didn't ask them to stay. He just watched as the room slowly, gradually began to thin. Not everyone left. Most stayed in their seats. Curiosity or principle or simple inertia keeping them planted, but enough left that the exodus became noticeable, became part of the story that was unfolding. Remember Sarah's promise? The one Garrett had made in that hospice bed while his wife's hand grew cold in his. Be there for Riley. Every milestone. Be present. Show her that her father keeps his word. That he's steady when everything else falls apart. Garrett was living it in real time. Refusing to move from the seat he'd chosen because moving would have meant breaking the promise. Would have meant teaching his daughter that other people's comfort mattered more than his commitment. But his brothers were living Sarah's promise too in their own way. Because being there for Garrett meant being there for Riley, meant making sure her father didn't have to choose between keeping his word and avoiding conflict. Meant showing a 12-year-old girl that family. Real family, the kind that shows up when it costs something. Doesn't abandon you when the room gets uncomfortable. The standoff continued. Principal Sullivan still spoke in hushed tones with the security officers. Parents still whispered and filmed and made judgments. And Garrett sat with his hands on his knees and his thumb on Sarah's keychain, steady and unshaken, surrounded by brothers who decided that this gymnasium on this evening was exactly where they needed to be. Principal Margaret Sullivan stepped away from the security officers. Her conversation with them concluded in a way that left both men looking uncertain, but compliant. She walked back across the gymnasium floor with the same measured pace. She'd used to descend from the stage, her heels clicking against the hardwood in a rhythm that seemed to count down to something. When she reached the stage steps, she climbed them slowly, deliberately, giving herself time to think, or perhaps giving the room time to settle into whatever came next. She returned to the microphone, her hands gripping the edges of the podium with a firmness that suggested she'd made a decision and intended to see it through regardless of the opinions that would follow. The gymnasium had gone quiet again. That particular kind of silence that comes when people are holding their breath, waiting to see which way the wind will blow. Principal Sullivan looked out across the rows of families, across the students on the risers behind her, across the security officers who stood with their arms crossed near the sidewall, and finally, briefly, her eyes landed on Garrett Thompson sitting in the third row with 12 Iron Brotherhood members scattered in the seats around him. She took a breath, then she spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, her voice carried across the gymnasium with the authority of someone who'd spent 2 decades managing rooms full of teenagers, parents, and competing interests. I want to acknowledge that this evening has had an unexpected development, and I want to address it directly because I believe we all deserve clarity. The room remained still. Every phone that had been lowered was raised again, recording, ready to capture whatever came next for the social media accounts that would dissect this moment long after the ceremony ended. We're all here for the same reason. Principal Sullivan continued, her tone shifting from authoritative to something softer, more personal. We're here to honor these young people, to celebrate their hard work, their growth, their achievements over the past year. That's what matters tonight. Not who's sitting where, not what anyone is wearing, not our comfort or discomfort with people who look different from what we expected. Garrett's face remained impassive, his expression unchanged. His hand still rested on his knees, his thumb still moved in slow circles across Sarah's keychain. If Principal Sullivan's words affected him, he didn't show it. He'd learned long ago that stillness was its own kind of armor, that showing nothing gave people nothing to use against you. Principal Sullivan's grip on the podium loosened slightly. Every family, she said, her words deliberate and measured, has the right to celebrate their child's achievements. Every parent who shows up, who keeps their promises, who sits in these seats because they love their son or daughter. They have earned the right to be here, and I will not ask anyone to leave simply because their presence makes others uncomfortable. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some parents nodded in agreement. Others exchanged glances that suggested they disagreed but weren't willing to say so publicly. The security officers near the wall shifted their weight, their body language suggesting they weren't entirely pleased with the principal's decision but understood the chain of command well enough to accept it. "So, let's proceed," Principal Sullivan said firmly. "Let's do what we came here to do. Let's honor these students." The security officers stepped back from their positions near Garrett, moving toward the perimeter of the gymnasium, where they took up posts by the exits. Not leaving, but no longer actively intervening. The first officer's jaw was tight with what might have been frustration or might have been relief that the decision had been taken out of his hands. The second officer glanced once more at the brothers, then looked away, accepting that this particular battle wasn't his to fight. In the seats surrounding Garrett, something subtle shifted. One of the brothers, the one with the braided gray beard, who sat 2 rows behind and slightly to the left, slowly reached up and removed his sunglasses. He folded them carefully, tucked them into his jacket pocket, and then his eyes found Garrett's. Even from several feet away, even without turning fully around, Garrett felt the gaze. He turned his head slightly, just enough to make eye contact. It was the same man. The one who'd knelt beside him on Interstate 84 3 years ago while fuel leaked and the desert sun beat down mercilessly. The one who'd said, "Stay with me, brother. You're not dying on this highway." The one whose hands had been part of the 12 pairs that lifted 600 pounds of burning metal off Garrett's chest. The one who'd waited until the ambulance arrived. Who'd stayed until Garrett was safely loaded into the rig. Who'd later, when Garrett tracked them down to say thank you, offered him not just gratitude received but brotherhood extended. The man nodded once, a slight dip of his chin that said everything without saying anything. "I remember you're not alone. We keep our promises too." Garrett's eyes watered. Just barely. Just enough that if you weren't looking directly at him, you might miss it entirely. The moisture gathered at the corners, threatening to spill, but not quite doing it. Held back by the same discipline that kept his hands steady on his knees and his breathing even. He blinked once, slow and deliberate. And when his eyes opened again, the moisture was gone, absorbed back into whatever reservoir of emotion he kept carefully contained. His hand tightened slightly on Sarah's keychain. His jaw flexed once, tension rippling across the muscle before it settled back into stillness. He nodded back at the brother, a gesture so small it might have been mistaken for nothing at all. But it wasn't nothing. It was acknowledgement. It was gratitude. It was the recognition that passed between people who'd carried each other's weight and understood that some debts could never be repaid because they were never meant to be debts in the first place. They were investments in a different kind of accounting. The kind where you show up because someone needs you. And later, when you need someone, they show up too. No ledger, no balance sheet. Just the understanding that brotherhood means you're never standing alone. Even when the world wants you to believe you are. Principal Sullivan had returned to her prepared remarks, reading from the paper in front of her with renewed energy, as if by returning to the script, she could smooth over the disruption and guide everyone back to the evening's intended purpose. The students on the risers began to relax, their postures loosening as they realized the ceremony would continue after all. Parents settled back into their seats, some relieved, some disappointed that the conflict had been resolved without the drama they'd been anticipating. But for Garrett, for the 12 brothers who'd ridden across town to be here, for Riley, who stood on the stage watching her father with eyes that understood more now than they had an hour ago. This moment was about something larger than a ceremony or a conflict or a decision made by a principal trying to do the right thing. It was about showing up, about keeping promises when they're hard to keep, about loyalty that doesn't calculate cost before it acts, about strength that doesn't need volume or violence to make itself known. If you believe showing up matters more than fitting in, if you've ever stood your ground when the easier choice was to walk away, if you understand that real loyalty means being present, even when your presence makes others uncomfortable, then you know what was happening in that gymnasium. You know that this wasn't just about one father at one graduation. It was about every person who's ever chosen principle over convenience. Who's ever kept a promise that cost them something? Who's ever believed that character is built in moments when no one's watching and proven in moments when everyone is? Drop a comment that says, "I stand for loyalty." And make sure everyone watching knows where you stand. Because what happens next in this story, the moment that would define this night and everything Garrett had been trying to teach his daughter about what it means to be steady when everything else is falling apart, was just beginning. The ceremony resumed with the kind of momentum that comes from collective relief. Families eager to return to the celebration they'd come for and leave the tension behind them. Principal Sullivan read names from the list in her steady, practiced cadence, each one followed by polite applause as students crossed the stage to accept their certificates. Parents stood with phones raised, capturing their children's moments. The flash of cameras creating small bursts of light across the darkened gymnasium. Nathan Anderson. Applause. A boy with braces walked across the stage, shook the principal's hand, accepted his certificate with both hands like he'd been taught. Madison Chen. More applause. A girl with long black hair tied back in a ribbon. Her smile nervous but proud. Jacob Foster. The pattern continued. Name after name. Each student getting their moment. Their families beaming from the audience. The normalcy of it all felt almost surreal after everything that had preceded it. But perhaps that was the point. Life continuing in spite of disruption. Ceremony persisting because ritual matters even when the world threatens to interrupt it. Garrett sat perfectly still through each name. His attention never wavering from the stage. His thumb had stopped moving across Sarah's keychain. His hand now closed around it completely, holding it the way you hold something precious when you need its strength more than its comfort. Then Principal Sullivan's voice shifted slightly, gaining a note of particular emphasis that suggested the name she was about to read carried weight beyond the ordinary. Riley Marie Thompson, graduating with highest honors, Academic Excellence Award. The applause that followed was different from what had come before. Not louder necessarily, but layered with something else. Awareness, curiosity. Some of it was genuine celebration for a student who'd clearly earned her recognition. Some of it was the awkward overcompensation of people trying to prove they weren't prejudiced by applauding extra hard, and some of it was simply the sound of a moment that everyone in the room understood had become more significant than a typical name being called. Riley stepped forward from her position on the risers and walked toward center stage with a composure that belied her 12 years. She'd practiced this walk in her bedroom the night before, had imagined how it would feel to cross in front of all these people, to accept the certificate and medal that represented 2 years of straight A's and late-night studying and refusing to let grief become an excuse for anything less than her best. But the reality of it, the weight of 300 pairs of eyes, the knowledge that somewhere in those seats her father was watching, that 12 brothers were watching, that everyone was watching, made her heart pound against her ribs in a way no amount of rehearsal could have prepared her for. She reached the center of the stage where Principal Sullivan stood holding the certificate in one hand and a medal on a blue ribbon in the other. Riley accepted both, the paper crisp against her fingers, the medal heavier than she'd expected. Principal Sullivan smiled at her with genuine warmth, the kind that suggested she understood exactly what this moment meant beyond the academic achievement it represented. But Riley didn't look at the principal. She didn't look at the audience spread out before her in a sea of faces she mostly didn't recognize. She turned her head slightly to the left, her eyes finding the third-row front section where her father sat surrounded by leather jackets and patches and men who'd ridden across town because one of their brothers had needed them. Garrett stood. The movement was fluid, unhurried, his large frame rising from the folding chair that suddenly seemed too small to have contained him. And as he stood, 12 brothers stood with him, not in perfect unison. They weren't soldiers, weren't performing choreography, but in a wave of solidarity that moved through the rows like a slow tide. One after another, they rose to their feet, their presence transforming from seated to standing. Their silent support made visible in the simple act of standing for a 12-year-old girl they'd come to protect by protecting her father. The applause started slow, a few hands clapping, tentative, and uncertain. Then more joined in. Parents who'd stayed in their seats when others fled, who'd watched the brothers enter and decided to withhold judgment, who'd listened to Principal Sullivan's words about every family deserving celebration and chosen to believe them. The applause built not into a thunderous ovation, but into something solid and real. Not everyone participated. Some families sat with their hands folded, their faces tight with disapproval or discomfort, but enough did. Enough that the sound filled the gymnasium with something that felt like validation. Riley's smile broke through then, unguarded and full in a way she rarely allowed herself to be in public. It wasn't the polite smile she'd given the principal or the nervous smile she'd worn while waiting on the risers. It was pure unfiltered joy mixed with pride mixed with relief mixed with the understanding that her father had kept his promise not just by being present but by refusing to be moved by staying exactly where he'd said he'd be no matter what it cost him. She stood there holding her certificate and medal and her father stood in the third row surrounded by his brothers. And for a moment the entire gymnasium existed in that space between them. A daughter and a father connected by something stronger than blood. Stronger than leather, stronger than the opinions of people who would never understand what it meant to keep a promise to someone who couldn't witness it being kept. But the moment that sealed this day, the one that would stay with Riley long after the applause faded and the gymnasium emptied and the certificates were framed and hung on walls, that moment happened after she left that stage. The ceremony concluded with Principal Sullivan's final remarks about the bright futures ahead for the graduating class. Her voice carrying the practiced optimism that school administrators reserved for milestone moments. Then it was over. The formality dissolved instantly into celebration as families flooded the gymnasium floor, converging on their children with cameras and congratulations and the relief that comes from sitting through an hour-long ceremony. The noise level rose immediately, voices overlapping, laughter echoing off the walls, the scrape of folding chairs being pushed aside as people navigated toward the stage. Garrett didn't move toward the stage. He stayed near the side exit where he'd been sitting, his back to the wall, giving the family space to have their moments without his presence complicating them. The 12 brothers flanked him loosely, not in any formal arrangement, but in a natural positioning of people who understood perimeter and protection without needing to discuss it. Some stood with their arms crossed, others had their hands in their pockets. One leaned against the wall beside Garrett, his eyes scanning the crowd with the casual alertness of someone who'd learned to read rooms long ago. Riley pushed through the crowd with single-minded determination, her certificate tucked under one arm, her medal still clutched in her right hand, the blue ribbon wrapped around her fingers. She navigated between families reuniting around younger siblings running in circles, past teachers offering congratulations to students they'd shepherded through the school year. Her eyes never left her father, locked on him like he was the only fixed point in a room full of movement. When she reached him, she stopped just for a moment, close enough to touch, but not touching yet. As if she needed to let the reality of the moment catch up with her body's arrival. They stood looking at each other, father and daughter, separated by 3 feet of space that felt both infinite and non-existent. No words at first, just the recognition that passes between people who've weathered something together, who've stood their ground when the easier choice would have been to retreat, who've kept promises when keeping them cost something. Then Riley spoke, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to crack through. "You kept your promise, Dad." Garrett's hand came up, his palm cupping the side of her face with a gentleness that contradicted every assumption people had made about him based on the patches on his back. His thumb brushed across her cheek once, a gesture so tender it seemed to exist in a different universe from the confrontation that had preceded it. "Always will, baby girl." The words were simple, almost plain in their construction, but they carried the weight of every milestone he'd shown up for, every moment he'd refused to miss, every time he'd chosen her over convenience or comfort or the path of least resistance. They carried the weight of Sarah's dying request and the keychain in his pocket and the 3 years he'd spent rebuilding a life around the single organizing principle that his daughter would never doubt his presence. Riley stepped forward then and wrapped her arms around him, the metal pressed between them, her face buried against his chest. Garrett's arms closed around her, steady and sure, holding her the way he'd held her when she was small enough to carry. When Sarah was still alive, when the world felt less complicated than it did now, one of the brothers, the one with the braided beard who'd removed his sunglasses earlier, stepped closer and placed his hand on Garrett's shoulder. The gesture was brief, just a moment of contact, but it carried meaning that didn't require elaboration. Sarah would be proud. Brother Garrett's jaw tightened, his eyes closing briefly against the emotion those words triggered. He nodded once, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. But the brother understood. Everyone who'd known Sarah understood. She would have been proud. Not just of Riley's academic achievements or the medal she'd earned, but of the way Garrett had shown up, had kept his word, had taught their daughter through action what it meant to be steady when everything else threatened to shake loose. The other brothers began moving toward the exit, not as a group, but in the gradual drift of people who understood it was time to leave, that the moment belonged to father and daughter now, and their presence was no longer needed. They nodded to Garrett as they passed. Small gestures of acknowledgement and solidarity, brothers confirming what they'd already known, that when one of them needed backup, the rest would show up without question or hesitation. Garrett and Riley stood there for another moment, holding each other while the gymnasium continued its celebration around them. Families taking photos and making plans and living in the joy of their children's achievements. Then Garrett pulled back slightly, his hands moving to Riley's shoulders. "You ready to get out of here?" Riley nodded, her smile returning. "Yeah." They moved toward the side exit together, Garrett's hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Riley still clutching her medal. The brothers had already pushed through the doors ahead of them, stepping out into the Oregon evening, where the heat still lingered even as the sun dropped toward the horizon. The doors swung shut behind the last of them, muffling the noise of the gymnasium, creating a momentary barrier between the ceremony they were leaving and whatever came next. But as they stepped outside into the Oregon heat, as Garrett's eyes adjusted to the change in light and his awareness expanded beyond the immediate presence of his daughter beside him, he realized the day wasn't over. The parking lot stretched out before them, rows of cars baking in the evening sun, heat radiating off asphalt, invisible waves. And there, leaning against a pickup truck near the edge of the lot, was someone waiting, someone who'd been part of the confrontation inside, someone who had unfinished business, someone whose presence suggested that what had been resolved in the gymnasium might not be resolved after all. The side doors opened onto a parking lot that shimmered with heat. The asphalt still radiating the day's accumulated warmth even as evening approached. Garrett stepped through first, Riley close beside him. The 12 brothers following in a loose formation that wasn't planned but felt instinctive. The contrast between the air-conditioned gymnasium and the Oregon heat was immediate and sharp, like walking into a wall of warmth that wrapped around skin and settled into lungs. The lead security officer stood 30 feet away, leaning against the driver's side door of a white pickup truck. He wasn't wearing his radio anymore. His uniform shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. His arms crossed loosely across his chest in a posture that read less as defensive and more as uncertain. When he saw them emerge, he straightened slightly, but didn't move toward them. The brothers' response was immediate and unspoken. They closed ranks around Garrett and Riley, not aggressively, but protectively, bodies shifting to create a barrier between the officer and the people they'd come to stand beside. Boots scraped against asphalt. Leather creaked. The air between the two groups felt charged with the possibility of conflict, though no one had said a word yet. The officer raised both hands, palms out, in the universal gesture of non-threat. "I just want to talk." Silence, the kind that stretches and tests, where every second feels weighted with decision. Garrett's hand rested on Riley's shoulder, steady and grounding. His eyes were fixed on the officer, reading body language, assessing intent, calculating risk the way anyone who'd lived through confrontations learned to calculate. The brothers waited, their stillness its own kind of readiness. Then Garrett's free hand moved, a small gesture toward the brothers. "Step back, give space." The movement was subtle but clear, and the brothers responded immediately, creating room without creating distance. Staying close enough to intervene, but far enough to allow conversation. Trust in action. Garrett walked forward, leaving Riley with the brothers, closing the distance between himself and the officer until they stood 10 feet apart. Close enough to speak without shouting, close enough to see each other's faces clearly. He stopped and waited, offering nothing, demanding the officer earn whatever came next. The officer's hands lowered to his sides. His jaw worked for a moment like he was testing words before releasing them. "I was wrong." The admission came out rough, unpracticed. "In there, I saw the jacket before I saw the father." Garrett didn't respond, didn't nod or accept or dismiss. Just stood there allowing the officer the discomfort of his own confession. The officer continued, his voice gaining strength as he pushed through whatever resistance made this hard. "My brother died on a motorcycle. 8 years ago, hit by a drunk driver on Highway 26 outside of Portland. He was wearing colors, different club than yours, but the jacket looked the same." He paused, his eyes dropping briefly to the asphalt before lifting again to meet Garrett's. "I never got over it. Never dealt with it properly. And I've been projecting that grief, that anger onto anyone who rides, onto anyone who wears what he wore." The words hung in the heated air between them. Confession, explanation, not quite apology, but moving in that direction. "I watched you in there," the officer said. "Watched how you didn't react. Didn't escalate. Just sat there keeping a promise to your daughter, and I realized I was doing to you what people did to my brother, judging the leather before knowing the man." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm sorry." Garrett stood silent for another long moment. His expression unreadable. Then his hand moved, extending forward, palm open. "An offer." The officer looked at the offered hand, then at Garrett's face, searching for something. Sincerity perhaps, or confirmation that the gesture was real and not performative. Then he stepped forward and took Garrett's hand. They shook, firm and brief. Two men acknowledging hurt and choosing something different than perpetuating it. No words accompanied the handshake. None were needed. Forgiveness didn't require speeches. Sometimes it just required the willingness to see the person instead of the pain, to choose understanding over the easier comfort of sustained judgment. When they released hands, the officer nodded once, then turned and climbed into his truck. The engine started and he pulled out of the parking lot slowly, disappearing into the evening traffic. Garrett watched him go, then turned back toward where Riley and the brothers waited. Strength without dominance, resolution without victory, just two broken people choosing not to break each other further. Garrett's bike sat at the edge of the parking lot, a black and chrome Harley that had carried him through thousands of miles and just as many moments of clarity. He'd parked it there that morning, choosing a spot away from the clusters of minivans and sedans, giving it space the way he always did. Now he and Riley sat on it together, engine off, the metal still warm from the day's heat. She sat in front of him, her back against his chest, her feet not quite reaching the foot pegs, the metal still clutched in her hand. The parking lot had mostly emptied, families dispersing to restaurants and ice cream shops to continue their celebrations. The brothers had moved to their own bikes, giving father and daughter privacy while remaining close enough that their presence was felt. They understood the value of space and the importance of not leaving until everyone was ready to leave. Riley broke the silence first, her voice quiet but direct. "Did you know they'd come?" Garrett's arms rested loosely around her, his hands clasped in front. "I called one brother. He called the rest. That's what family does." She absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. "But you didn't ask them to come." "Didn't have to. Just told them where I'd be and that it might get complicated. The rest figured itself out." Riley was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had been building in her for years. Through every stare and whisper and moment of watching people judge her father before knowing him. "Is that why you never take off your jacket, even when people look at you like you're dangerous?" Garrett's chest rose and fell with a slow breath. "This jacket is a reminder that I'm never alone, that I belong to something bigger than myself, that there are people who will show up when I need them, no questions asked." He paused, his voice softening. "You're not either alone. I mean, you've got me. You've got them." He gestured slightly toward the brothers waiting by their bikes. "And you've got your mother's strength in you, even if she's not here to see it." Riley's hand moved to the metal, her fingers tracing the engraved letters that marked her achievement. "I miss her." "Me too, baby girl." Every day they sat in the comfortable silence that exists between people who don't need words to fill every gap. The sun continued its descent, painting the Oregon sky in shades of orange and pink. The heat finally beginning to break as evening settled properly. Riley's hand moved from the metal to Garrett's hand, her small fingers wrapping around his larger ones. She felt the keychain there, the one she'd seen him hold 1,000 times, the one that had belonged to her mother. She'd never asked about it directly, respecting the privacy of his grief. But now, after everything that had happened, she wanted to know. "The keychain," she said softly. "What's on it?" Garrett pulled it from his pocket, the worn metal catching the fading light. He turned it over in his palm, showing her the back where words had been engraved in simple block letters. 5 words that Sarah had chosen years ago, back when Garrett was still figuring out what kind of man he wanted to be, what kind of father he could become. Riley leaned forward, reading the inscription aloud. "Show up, stand tall, stay true. Your mother gave this to me when you were born," Garrett said. "Told me these 3 things would make me a good father. Said everything else was just details." His thumb brushed across the engraved letters. She was right about this, about most things. Riley turned in the seat, shifting so she could look at her father's face. "You did all 3 today. You showed up even when they didn't want you there. You stood tall even when they tried to make you small. And you stayed true to your promise. Garrett's eyes met hers, and something passed between them that went beyond words. Understanding, recognition, the knowledge that they'd both survived something together. Not just the ceremony, but the years of grief and rebuilding that had preceded it. That they'd kept faith with Sarah's memory by living according to the principles she'd valued. You did those things, too, Garrett said. Worked hard, earned that medal, made your mother proud, even though she's not here to tell you herself. Riley's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. Do you think she knows about today? Garrett pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her in the kind of embrace that answers questions words can't quite reach. Yeah, baby girl, I think she knows. The brothers had given Garrett and Riley their time, had respected the space that father and daughter needed to process everything that had happened. But now they gathered near their bikes in a loose formation, engines still silent, their presence a quiet reminder that while the moment had been personal, they'd been part of making it possible. Their motorcycles lined up in the parking lot like sentinels. Chrome catching the last rays of sunlight, leather seats still warm from the ride over. Garrett and Riley dismounted from his bike and walked toward the gathering. The brothers didn't crowd or rush forward. They waited with the patience of men who understood that some approaches needed to happen at their own pace. When Garrett and Riley reached them, the lead brother with the braided beard stepped forward first, his weathered face creasing into a genuine smile as he looked at Riley. "Congratulations, young lady," he said, his voice rough but warm. "Heard you graduated top of your class. That takes dedication." Riley held up her medal. A small gesture of pride mixed with shyness in front of these men who'd ridden across town for her father. "Thank you." Another brother, the younger one with the scar across his cheek, came forward next. "Your dad talks about you all the time. Sounds like you earned every bit of that honor." One by one, they offered their congratulations. No bravado, no posturing, just genuine warmth from men who understood what it meant to achieve something through sustained effort, who respected hard work regardless of whether it happened on a highway or in a classroom. Each acknowledgement was brief but sincere, delivered with the kind of straightforward honesty that came from people who didn't waste words on things they didn't mean. The lead brother crouched down slightly, so he was closer to Riley's eye level, his hands resting on his knees. "Your old man's got a lot of road left in him, a lot of miles to ride, a lot of promises to keep." He paused, his eyes serious. "Make sure he knows he's got backup, that he doesn't have to carry everything alone. That's what we're here for." Riley looked at him, then at the other brothers gathered around, then back at her father, who stood beside her with his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She understood what the brother was really saying. That brotherhood extended beyond her father, that it included her by extension, that the network of support he'd built over years of showing up for others would be there for both of them when they needed it. She turned back to the brothers, her voice steady and clear despite the emotion of the evening. "Thank you for showing up." The lead brother straightened, his expression softening further. "That's what brothers do." The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than elaborate speeches could have managed. It was the distillation of everything that had happened that evening. The phone call Garrett had made, the rides across town, the silent entrance into the gymnasium, the standing when Riley's name was called. All of it reduced to 5 words that explained everything and nothing simultaneously. The brothers began moving toward their bikes, then the gathering naturally dissolving as each man prepared for the ride home. They didn't linger or drag out goodbyes. That wasn't their style. They'd come when called. They'd stood when needed. And now the moment was complete, and it was time to return to their own lives, their own families, their own roads. Engines started not with the aggressive roar of people making a statement, but with the steady rumble of machines being brought to life for practical purpose. The sound built gradually as each bike fired up, creating a layered chorus of mechanical heartbeats that filled the parking lot without dominating it. The brothers mounted their bikes with the practiced ease of people who'd done this thousands of times, settling into seats that fit them like old friends. They pulled out single file, no theatrics or showboating, just a measured departure that respected the residential area surrounding the school. No wheelies, no revving engines, just 12 motorcycles moving in sequence down the parking lot access road toward the main street. Their tail lights creating a line of red dots against the deepening dusk. Garrett and Riley stood side by side watching them go, his arm draped across her shoulders, her medal still clutched in her hand. The brothers didn't look back or wave dramatically. They just rode, their formation holding steady as they reached the main road and turned west toward the setting sun. Their silhouettes gradually shrinking as distance consumed them.